There's no question that the Terra leak was the biggest information dump in Pokemon history. From scrapped concepts to entire cancelled games, this leak was a goldmine for any die-hard Pokemon fan. In my last video, I took a deep dive into all of the leaked content from Pokemon Sun and Moon, but today we're shifting gears to Generation 6, and even touching on some fascinating bits from the tail end of Generation 5. Rather than rehashing well-known topics like Sci-Fi Kalos or Pokemon Z, I want to focus on the lesser-known details, the stuff you probably haven't heard before. But don't worry, I'll cover as much ground as possible when it comes to Generation 6. So without further ado, let's dive right into it, starting with Generation 5's originally planned extended timeline. Originally, Generation 5 was intended to last until 2014, making it a full 4-year cycle, just like Generations 3 and 4. Game Freak had actually mapped out a schedule where each year would introduce a new mythical Pokemon, each inspired by a previous iconic mythical. There's a strong case to be made that Game Freak initially envisioned Generation 5 as a major soft reboot for the franchise. I feel like this theory is slightly boosted by the Pokemon XY beta, where it was discovered that Game Freak had actually created a fully 3D model for Hilda, one of the black and white protagonists. At first glance, you might assume she was just a placeholder model, while Game Freak designed new characters for Pokemon X and Y. But here's the thing, why choose Hilda of all characters? If they just needed a test model, they could have gone with a generic trainer or even an entirely new design, but instead they specifically modeled Hilda in 3D. This raises some possibilities. Maybe it was a temporary model, or maybe the team was truly considering of bringing over past protagonists into new games. We know Generation 5 pushed a more narrative approach to the games, so perhaps Game Freak were a bit more open to exploring new games with returning characters. We'll likely never know Game Freak's true intentions for Generation 5. Generation 6 was in development for roughly 3 years, with the earliest builds from the Terra leak dating back to 2011, right in the middle of Black 2 and White 2's development. At this stage, Pokemon X and Y had a very different feel. The visuals were almost a hybrid between Animal Crossing and Pokemon, with even smaller chibi models, but still a rough concept of a French-inspired region taking shape. By now you've probably seen these early builds circulating online, and you might have heard about the dynamic battles they featured. Junichi Masuda himself had been pushing for experimenting with a brand new feature, dubbed the Masuda Cam, a more cinematic battle system with dynamic camera angles and expressive animations. Despite the Masuda Cam level of detail not making it to the final game, this still laid the groundwork for the mainline 3D Pokemon battles we see today. As development progressed, we can start seeing early drafts of the story, including one massive cut plot twist. AZ was originally meant to be the final villain of Pokemon X and Y. In this version of the story, AZ wouldn't just be a tragic figure from Kalos' past. He would have been revealed as the true leader of Team Flare, using Lysander as a mere pawn. His ultimate goal? To activate the ultimate weapon once again, wiping out the world's corruption and reviving only those he deemed worthy. Honestly, that sounds like something straight out of a movie, and I would have loved to see this twist play out in X and Y. In the final game, AZ's backstory still revolves around creating the ultimate weapon, his rage and sorrow over the Kalos War, his inability to forgive the world, and his ultimate redemption after battling the player. His final dialogue even hints at his villainous potential, as he talks about finally being free of his sorrow and the part of him that built the ultimate weapon. I feel like there's so much untapped potential in the storyline. But that said, I do wonder how AZ would have fit into Team Flare's hierarchy. Maybe there was a whole cut section towards the end of the game where AZ did a classic wrestling heel turn on the player and took over Team Flare to cause chaos. Perhaps Game Freak shift directions entirely and just drop the twist for pacing reasons. Either way, the final battle against AZ still works within the story, even if his role was significantly toned down. Speaking of AZ, there's also this image of an early version of his design. While some fans speculate this was just a placeholder, others believe AZ was originally meant to be Professor Sycamore's ancestor. Personally, I think it's the former, since the lineage doesn't really seem to impact the overall story. One detail I noticed across the lot of the XY concept art is how sci-fi inspired Kalos originally was. Many areas look more dystopian and futuristic, with abstract architecture scattered throughout the region. At the same time, we also see historically inspired landmarks, giving the region a unique blend of old and new. It makes me wonder what Game Freak's original vision for Kalos really was. Maybe they really wanted to emphasize the transition to 3D by designing a more futuristic Pokemon world. Even the Pokemon Center concept art reflects this shift, and that design actually made it into the final game. X and Y also had a ton of scrapped gameplay features that could have made the experience even smoother. I found an interesting cut feature that involved a special mechanic with your running shoes. By tapping B twice, your trainer would gain a temporary speed boost. This would allow you to avoid the trainer's line of sight completely, which would have been a huge quality of life feature in my opinion, and I'm so surprised this never made it into any Pokemon game. Using this feature in grass would have made the encounter rate increase too. Kalos also had a planned skiing mechanic tied to a ski resort, a unique concept that sadly never made it into the final game. Unlike regular movement, skiing would have been available only in these resorts, allowing players to travel at a much faster speed. To put things into perspective, walking is 1 times speed, sprinting is 2 times speed, double sprinting and cycling is 3 times speed, and skiing would be 4 times speed. So yeah, you'd be going pretty fast. I believe Route 17, which currently forces you to ride a Mamoswine, is the only logical place where the ski resort could have existed. Perhaps this was cut due to time constraints or difficulties in implementing skiing animations, but it's another example of X and Y having ideas that never reached their full potential. Aside from the running shoes, there was also a planned feature for cosmetic shoes that would increase your walking speed. Unlike the double sprint mechanic, these would passively affect movement, making exploration just a bit smoother. However, in the final game you're always wearing roller skates, so it wouldn't make sense to implement this mechanic. Mirage Island was also supposed to be in X and Y. You know, that one location in Hoenn that only appears for an insane number of odds, but from all of the information given, this wouldn't have been the same island from the Hoenn region, but it would have brought over the Mirage Island concept to Kalos, with some new features. If you rolled the correct random number, you'd be able to surf to this island and place a flag on it, and the island would now permanently appear on your map. You'd be able to name the island, and then it would have multiplayer functions over Wi-Fi. Although it wasn't a major gameplay addition, I like that the island wouldn't just disappear and instead become a part of your game. Diving was another cut feature in X and Y, but unlike the separate underwater maps from Hoenn, Kalos' diving system was designed to be tactically integrated into the overworld. I could see this being a feature to get around obstacles, or access restricted areas to get rare items or Pokemon. X and Y also had a number of added content features that were cut too, like the Champions Room. Becoming the Pokemon League champion was meant to come with an extra feature, a Champions Room where players could receive challenges trying to take the title. Maybe it could have worked similar to how the Battle Tree does. A feature called the Sharing Dungeon was also scrapped, which was a procedurally generated dungeon area that would be shared through your friend code. It would also provide a co-op gameplay experience, and dungeons only required 1 game card, so even your friends that don't have Pokemon games would be able to play along. Game Freak also planned a feature called My Gym, another gym building feature similar to what we saw in the Sun and Moon video, although this version was more focused towards online gameplay. You'd create gyms and post them, allowing players around the world to challenge it. Players would then be set as NPCs in the gym after conquering it. I find it interesting that Game Freak planned some kind of gym building feature for 2 generations, and we know that Game Freak love to revisit scrapped ideas, so it makes me wonder if it's still something Game Freak plans to implement someday. Pokemon Circus was a minigame acting as a spiritual successor to Pokemon contests. Players would put on performances with their Pokemon, likely judged on moves, coordination, and appeal, similar to the scrapped Pokemon stage feature from Sun and Moon. Another cut feature was commemorative photos, allowing players to capture moments right after catching and nicknaming Pokemon. These photos would be saved directly to the 3DS system. Pokemon X and Y had quite a few scrapped Pokemon designs, most of them dating back to 2011, early in the game's development. Now, these weren't just rough sketches or early concepts, some of them were fully designed Pokemon that were pretty much ready for the final game. 2 designs in particular stood out, a water beetle Pokemon and a flamingo Pokemon. The flamingo in particular has a lot of the classic Kalos design tropes, so I wonder how far along into development it was cut. Of course, the biggest scrapped Pokemon we know of is Mega Jynx, a Pokemon that was fully modeled but never made it into the final game. This is the only cut Mega Evolution we've ever seen evidence of, making it one of the most intriguing removals in Pokemon history. What set the Pokemon community on even more fire was when we learned that a 3D model of Mega Jynx had been created on Pokemon Day 2012, meaning it wasn't just planned, but actually modeled and rendered for the game. Eventually its design was found, as well as the reasoning for its removal, which is directly linked to Jynx's problematic past, so I understand why the Pokemon company decided to cut it. We've covered a lot of scrapped X and Y content, and we haven't even mentioned Pokemon X2 and Y2, a set of sequels that were heavily rumored for a 2015 release. Unlike most fan speculation, this wasn't just a baseless rumor. Actual code of a second set of Kalos games was found in a previous Nintendo Giga leak, and even more shockingly, an actual version Z label was discovered in the Terra leak. So what does this mean? Well, at some point, Game Freak had planned for some kind of follow-up to X and Y, whether it was a third version like Pokemon Z or full sequels like X2 and Y2. The biggest question is how much these games would have expanded the story and the gameplay in general. We know that Zygarde would have played a much bigger role, especially considering the Zygarde forms that eventually appeared in Sun and Moon, but what about AZ? His story was still left open-ended, and given that he played such a major role in Kalos' past, maybe he was directly tied to creating Zygarde's forms in some way too. Maybe the sequels would have given us more details about the Great War. And I can't forget to mention South Kalos, a whole section of a region that was cut from the final game. It's possible that this area could have been explored in the sequels, giving us new cities and potentially even a new Pokemon League structure. It's honestly tragic that Pokemon X and Y never got a second chance. A lot of people talk about how Sun and Moon lost a ton of content, but at least we got Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon. X and Y, on the other hand, were left without this second chance. And that's why so many people are excited for Legend ZA, because for the first time in 12 years, we might finally see some expanded Kalos content that was maybe cut from the original games. For the most part, I felt like ORAS was a complete game. It faithfully recreated Generation 3 Hoenn, expanded on features, and even introduced new content like the Delta episode. But that doesn't mean everything made the cut. One of the most interesting removals was the character Max, the younger brother of Mei from the anime. He was designed for the game, but for some reason he was cut. The big question is, where would he fit into the story? If Game Freak included him, they probably wanted Max to have a bigger role than just a cameo, but maybe they couldn't figure out where to place him. Another big cut feature was a scrapped Jirachi event. This event was listed before the Deoxys event, meaning it was likely planned for the post-game, but the wording was almost identical to the Diancie, Hooper, and Volcanion events, suggesting that it was probably a cutscene event rather than a full capture sequence. What's interesting is why this event was scrapped. Perhaps this event was set outside the Pokemon Center. Fans have speculated for years that the White Rock in Moss Deep City is somehow connected to Jirachi, yet nothing ever came of it. If this event was supposed to take outside and tie into the White Rock, it would have finally given fans the payoff they'd been waiting for since Pokemon Ruby and Sapphire first released. Unfortunately, we never got to see it happen. I strongly believe X and Y are the most underrated games in the series, but it also takes the #1 spot as the most unfinished Pokemon games. Despite needing it the most, these games never got a second set of games, they never got DLC, and they also stand in this transition period between 2D and 3D Pokemon games. Game Freak not only had to create a game within a 3-year generation cycle, they had to set a foundation for Pokemon in a 3D environment, and while it was completely stripped from reaching its full potential, I still think they made a pretty good game. Thanks for watching this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. I'll see you in the next one.